highlights for this week. So I'll just get through those so we can get to other discussion. First of all, I want to say thank you and welcome to our new committers and PMC members. So there are quite a few new committers and PMC members. I want to pass it. I'm going to put Fako and Jack on the spot to introduce and just list them off. Is Jack here? I don't think so. So I want to congratulate. Oh man, I wasn't prepared. I was going to put you guys on the spot.
Go.
Yes, I'll take it over.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So we have a lot of new folks. I think it was long overdue. We had like a lot of. It's good always to have new bandwidth and have fast responses on the PRs. So for Iceberg, we have like Hona, who was like committed for a while now, is part of the PMC. And so we also have someone to validate it by Iceberg, which led to like a very fast release this time. We have Sung and Kevin, who all join us as a committer. On Rust, we have Xanwo, who was also part of this call, joining us as a committer. And we have Renjie, who was doing a lot of the groundwork on the Iceberg Rust initially as a new PMC member. And we have Piotr, which is doing a lot of awesome work. He did a lot of work on the what was it, like the Puffin files on the Iceberg library and all the specs and stuff. So it's also great to have him as a committer over there.
Thanks, Fako, and awesome work, everyone. Really, thank you for all your awesome contributions. Great to have you guys in the community, and yeah, just thanks a lot. I'll move on to highlights. Thank you to JB for getting the 1.6 release out. Really great to have that. And I know we're probably going to fast follow with a 1.6.1 release, at least in the Java side for probably the Avro CVE. Thank you for adding that to the releases. I missed that somehow. I was like on to 1.7, but yeah. Yeah, it's always good to have patch releases. I'm hoping that we can also get that memory fix that Piotr got out there, because I think that's an important thing for the Trino side, which is, I'll actually skip to that one. So Piotr, one of our new committers, updated ParallelIterable to limit memory consumption. This was a great new idea. So in the past, we've had people that come in and try to basically swap out the queue that we use for holding tasks as we find tasks in parallel. And limiting that queue, unfortunately, blocks tasks in the thread pool that's shared across all planning tasks. So that would be a problem if we were to actually like hard limit that queue and block those tasks. However, Piotr came up with a great idea that didn't involve passing a different thread pool or starting a new thread pool for every planning task. What he did was just had the tasks yield when the queue gets to approximately some size. So basically voluntary yielding the tasks exit the queue and then are re-added once the size drops to about half of the limit, which I think is a really clever and good solution to this problem, because we don't actually have to spawn threads all over the place to solve it, but we do actually limit memory consumption. So big thanks to Piotr for finally solving that issue. That's been a thorny one for quite some time. Big thanks to Farouk for adding support for appending files with different partition specs. I think that this is I'm guessing that this is a help for the Kafka Connect stuff, which actually has a second highlight, which is that Kafka Connect now has a runtime distribution. So thanks to Bryan Keller for adding the runtime for Kafka Connect. I think that this is basically much like the Flink, Hive, and Spark runtime jars. This is a single jar that bundles everything that you need to plug into Kafka Connect. So you can just have one jar that you upload and has everything in it. very much easier on our users than building their own jars. So thanks, Bryan, there. Great to see so much progress on the Kafka Connect side. I'm really hoping to see that, maybe some blog posts and things for the 1.7 release. Also, we should consider, while we're there, an earlier 1.7 release to get some of this work out. Flink has also seen some rapid improvements. So I picked a couple of them, but I know that there are also a few more here. First of all, the Flip 27 batch sources now have limit pushdown support, which is really cool. I think a lot of people are waiting on those types of things, so you don't have to plan an entire job just to satisfy a simple limit 10 query. They've added support for speculative execution in Flink, and I saw a few other improvements, things like now I'm blanking on it. Some just handling improvements for execution. So great to see the Flink support improving. And I'll also hand it off to Fako to talk about Python, Rust, and Go.
Yeah, so we had the 0.7 release, which is huge. I'll look it up. There it is. There. Yeah, so we have partition rights, which is very exciting. Deletes, appends, like everything is in there. Yeah, we have the fast commit, but now also like that's one we had before, where you actually write like a manifest on each write, and now we also have the merge append, where you can also actually generate less metadata to have more efficient reads later on. Yeah, it's a whole list. I would just suggest give it a try. It's on a dev list. There's a lot of new stuff in there, so that's very exciting. We're actually working on a 0.7.1 because we have like some small issues there. We want to capture like in a follow-up release, same with Java. But it might also be a 0.8 release because there's also some bigger stuff already coming up again. And we actually want to improve the release cadence quite a bit because the 0.7 took quite a bit of time to get out. Yeah, for the Rust, we're actually blocked on the Avro RS release because we are unable to write the field IDs, which are super important for Iceberg. So just one vote shy. Different Ryan's actually doing release verification right now. I did for Java. I'm pretty sure that everything checks out. So if you're using Avro in a different language, please make sure that you check out the release. Yeah, and for Go, we actually had the Boolean expression filters being implemented. So this is like a next step in the query planning in Go. There's another PR already open for buying everything together. So also, if you're good in Go, I do a lot of releases, but I'm not very fluent in Go. So if you're like a Go enthusiast, I would highly encourage you to also check out the PRs by Matt because they're really good. And I'm skipping over one thing. Xuanwo is actually, oh no, sorry. Farouk is actually also working on an in-memory catalog implementation for Rust, also to facilitate testing and make it easier to get people started. I think that's it from my side, Ryan.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Fako. I'll just immediately hand it over to JB to talk about 1.6.1 bug or patch release.
Yeah, so there are two. I mean, there are the Avro updates that Fako and I started that include the CVE fixes. We still have to close the 1.12 vote, and I know that two guys are struggling about the test, so I'm trying to help them to pass through, and then the 1.11.4 will follow up, I guess. So the purpose of the 1.6.1 is to include these dependency updates. And I know that Piotr also mentioned a couple of fixes he wanted to include, but initially he wanted in 1.6, but he didn't have time, so I have to check on the GitHub issues. But there are one more pull request to include in 1.6.1. What's the proposal?
The Avro update here to pull in the CVE. Is this a major-ish release of Avro, or is it a patch release? I know Avro doesn't follow the semantic versioning, so I'm just wondering, is this an update that we should put in one of our patch releases, or are there API changes?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ryan. Actually, for Hona, we prepared 2 releases. One is the Avro 112, more specifically for Iceberg Rust. And we also prepared the 111.4, which is a minor for Avro, more for the Java scope. So it's going to be a minor release of Avro.
Okay, perfect. I think that's that's good, because I'm pretty careful, or I like to be pretty careful about what goes into a patch release. I think we got burned on that in the past, where Orc updated their like shipped new code in a patch release, like a transitive dependency. Okay, awesome. Thank you. So I think that affects the 1.7 release timeline, because if we needed to get that CVE out and we didn't have a suitable release from Avro, we would probably want to do it in a 1.7. I have also heard of people that want to do maybe a faster 1.7 release to get things like some client updates to the REST API out. Is there any other interest in doing that out there? Anyone that wants to volunteer to be release manager for 1.7? We're very much at the beginning of planning for this. Russell.
Yeah, I'm up to do release for 1.7. I also am interested in the 1.7 release. In your discussion point a little bit below, I was thinking that 1.7 may be a good, not finalization of format version 3, but starting us getting everything out for format version 3 and then finalizing it in the one after that. But that's the main thing I want to get into 1.7. I have the PR up already to start plugging in V3 things, and I'd like to start getting that tested before we close down the spec.
Sounds good. I think it would be good for us to try and get those things done. I'll revisit that when we start talking about the V3 stuff. In the past, when we've talked about V3, we've thrown a lot of stuff in there, but I think this is correct in like, hey, maybe we need to defer some of those things. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Thanks for volunteering here. It's awesome to have RM identified right away, so thanks. All right, I have 3 things in just short items that I think should be addressed and taken care of before we get to longer discussion topics. So the first is really happy to see the Kafka Connect runtime distribution. However, I want to remind everyone, and especially committers and PMC members, that anytime third-party code is shipped with one of our jars, we really need to make sure that we're updating the license and notice files in those jars. So I was looking at the Kafka Connect stuff this morning. I hadn't been following it, and it looks like it just ships the root license file. And our policy for other jars is actually to have a license file specific to every single runtime jar that covers all of the third-party code that's in that jar. This is really, really important because releases are an act of the foundation and need to comply with open source license requirements. So everything needs to have a notice file for required legal notices for the code that we're shipping. And it also needs to have a license file to cover the licenses under which you're using basically all of the code in the artifacts that we ship. So this is also super important on other projects. So the Python side, the Rust side, Go, but particularly in Java, where we tend to ship these runtime or bundle jars. Anytime a runtime or bundle jar changes, we need to make sure that we've updated the license. So first of all, I think we're going to go back through and add a license and notice file for the new runtime. This is blocking a 1.7 release, but we've hopefully got plenty of time. I'm just going to note that. The opportunity here, I think, is a good one for new committers, if anyone, or new contributors, anyone that wants to help us update the build. I was talking with Dan about this just before this meeting, which is like, how do we more effectively catch situations like this? Can we add something to the build where when a transitive dependency changes, we check that against the list of things that we've updated the license and notice for, and sort of have this tracking so that we at least know, like, hey, we added a transitive dependency, by updating some direct dependency, and now we need to go update the notice file for it. 1 second, JB. The second idea, so we know that there are tools out there to generate a list of transitive dependencies. And then the other thing is we may just want to have some sort of release target that figures out all of the file diffs between jars from, say, 1.6.1 to 1.7. JB?
Yeah, no, actually, you already said. I mean, on bunch of Apache projects, especially the one using Maven, we have tooling to generate this and at least help to review. So I guess that we probably have the same tooling with Gradle. I know Beam is doing that, so I can take a look and try to experiment on Iceberg. But yeah, I mean, doing manually, it's painful. So having a tooling to at least to help it to generate a kind of template and that we can review, that's probably the best option. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I would love to have that tooling. I think it's a great point, because this is an area where I think one of our risks as a project is adding these things, because this happened a few months ago when we added the Azure and S3 and Google storage bundles. We forgot to do the licenses. Luckily, I noticed and we were able to fix it, but this is another case, so it's probably time for some tooling. So yeah. I don't want to distract too much on that. I also, moving on from the Kafka Connect stuff, I was hoping someone who's working on Kafka Connect could give an overview of what the status is now, because the addition of a runtime bundle seems like we might be good to go. So how close are we to like having something that you can easily deploy and is there, rather than relying on the bundle from the tabular repository?
Yeah, I mean, I can update that. So yeah, it's good to go. I mean, try out the distribution bundle once I add the license files, of course. And yeah, so give it a try, see what happens. But I have the runtime, I have the integration tests. I've tested it myself, so it'd be great to get feedback. I mean, the only difference is that it doesn't have the Delta writer support. So if you're relying on that, you can't really transition from the old tabular connector. But if you're just doing appends, then yeah, should be ready.
I think that there are still a couple PRs out. Like there's some documentation PRs that are under review right now. Is there anything else, Bryan, that's outstanding?
I mean, there's like an improvement to there's a zombie fencing improvement that we're adding, documentation, and yeah, and then if we want to add any additional SMTs, like the transforms, but I don't think those are critical for the functioning of the thing.
What about the dead letter queue?
I mean, that's not in there, so, but neither is it in the tabular version, I don't think, or is it?
I believe that it is. So that's something else that we could potentially look into adding if anybody's interested in. incorporating.
Right. Yeah. So, but I mean, as it stands now, it's functional. But yeah, we can definitely make improvements and add features.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for working on that. Really great to see that going into the main project, and having a full Apache release. So thank you guys a lot. The third short item I wanted to cover was the timing of the REST catalog sync. That used to be every Monday at 9 a.m. I believe now we've moved that so that it's not every week and also not conflicting with this. I was hoping Jack would be here to give an update on that. Let me find it really quick. Does anyone recall? There we go. Meeting time for the catalog sync. So it's going to be alternating morning and evening so that we can cover both European time zones and Asian time zones. So it will be alternating Wednesday 9 a.m. Pacific time every 3 weeks starting 8/7, and Wednesday 8 p.m. Pacific time recurring every 3 weeks starting 8/14 the next week. So that's a week from today. It will be every 3 weeks at this time, 9 a.m. Pacific. And it will be, I guess, 11 hours later the following week, and both of those will recur every 3 weeks. I think that Jack is working on an invite or has an invite that will be updated. I haven't necessarily seen that go out yet, but I want to make sure everyone knows about it. There was also a question on the mailing list about the calendar that is used to hold this sync, which I believe was owned or was part of the tabular account, and we are not sure who actually created or owned it. So that's kind of my bad. So I will figure out the calendar stuff, and we still have the Google group for the sync. So I think we'll move back to the Google group, which I believe is just adding the invite for this, inviting the Google group, and then everyone who is signed up for that Google group will be invited to the sync. So I'm hoping that what we can do is just do this for all of the syncs moving forward. We'll use the Google group so you can self-select whether you want to see the invites or not.
Do you want me to help on that, or who's working on that, and do they need any help?
I think that I can take care of that.
Okay.
The nice thing about using the Iceberg sync Google group is that it's self-selecting. You can easily, get all the invites and things like that. That worked pretty well. And then that way we don't lose track of the calendars. That was also owned by my personal Gmail account, rather than a corporate account, since, corporate accounts change. Being able to, not lose track of that, and also be able to add administrators across organizations. Because that Iceberg sync Google group is probably something where we should have more PMC members on it as owners. So I'll take care of that, and I'll coordinate with you if we need anything. We probably will want to update the website to point to that Google group.
That was one of my questions. And the second one was like, do we want to continue on Google Meet / this Fathom note taker thing? Is there something else we can use? Like JB and I had talked about seeing if at some point Apache might have some infrastructure we can use, but that's not coming up anytime soon. So is like, do we just keep using Google Meet in the meantime? And
yeah, it's free and it works well. I'm pretty sure I can arrange to have a recording either through Google, or we can continue with Fathom. Doesn't matter to me how we do that.
Yeah. I don't know if people find the summaries that Fathom generates useful at all. Like, I got to the point where I wasn't doing anything custom with it. I pretty much just take a lot of the stuff, and if there's something that I want to add or remove from it, I do that. But for the most part, it like does a good job. So I don't know if that matters or how you prefer going forward with it, Ryan. But yeah, we don't have, the only reason we have Fathom at this point was that we were playing around with the kind of summary features there, and it does a decent job, I'd say.
I'm good with that. I think, you know, the most important thing is putting these out there so that other people can keep up with it. And yeah, it's really nice that it has the note-taking feature. So thanks for running that, Bryan.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Let's get to main topics of discussion. I think the first one here, format v3. I think we're finally getting to the point where we've got some stuff for format v3 that we want to actually get out there, and it's probably time to do the hard work of determining like what makes the cut or what does not. So the questions are, you know, what goes into format v3? There are a few suggestions. And then there's also, should it be adopted for Iceberg 1.7? I personally would push back on that question because I don't think that we should tie format release versions to Iceberg releases. Certainly, like, I would want v3 features to be present and, like, as much as possible complete, hopefully in the 1.7 timeframe. But I don't know that we would want to say tie a v3 release to a 1.7 release. Anyone have opinions there?
Well, I noted earlier, basically the same thing I said, is I would also like to get features out, but not consider it closed. I want to have those disjoint just in case we run into things or we find that there's just something we absolutely want to do now rather than push out for another upgrade cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it makes sense to have some kind of best default for 1.7 that include v3. And if we can, I mean, we can always do 1.8, including new things, new features. That's my guessing.
Sounds good. Dan.
I guess one of the things is like defining a closed version of what the spec v3 is, because like we have both the reference implementation, but like we have all of the other languages as well, and we want to give them targets that they can start working on independently. So we shouldn't like think about it in terms of, oh, what's the Java implementation and where is that? Because it's very possible that once we nail down the spec, like Rust or Python might be able to nail some of those things first. So it's more about, let's define what the v3 spec is, get that nailed down, and then each one of the projects can kind of work towards, you know, support for the v3 spec independently.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think the next big question is what goes into v3, and I know that there's, you know, a lot of interest in timestamp nanos. I just got back to those reviews yesterday. I am sorry that it takes me so long to get back to those. I think we need to, like, I'm going to prioritize v3 stuff over the next couple of months to make sure that we can do this. I think that, so I'll throw out a straw man proposal, which is that we know that we want new types. Timestamp nanos, variant is actually getting quite close as well. We need to figure out where that spec lives. But I think that we're pretty much close to saying, like, we know what variants are going to look like. We know what shredding for variants is going to look like, and we're ready to start getting the implementation in. And a lot of that implementation already exists. So both variant, timestamp nanos, I think that it would make sense to have a null type, and, you know, potentially other types. I want to throw out there that while we don't necessarily want to throw in, the kitchen sink for every format release, it would make sense if we didn't string out things like new types. So I like having sort of well-defined format releases, so you can think of them in terms of functionality, and it's not hard to say like, oh, timestamp nanos came out in v3, variant came out in v4, null type came out in v5, and like I think what I would propose is trying to get all of the new types that we want to define into the v3 spec, as well as I would say type promotion, since those things are fairly easy to define and not actually a ton of code. And then the default value stuff, which I think has been in the spec for quite some time, but has not actually seen a robust implementation. So I think those three things do make sense. And I would say focusing on those three gives us a pretty reasonable scope, because it's, default, it's basically things that help us improve compatibility with like CDC use cases. And it's a complete version of those things. Dan?
So I generally agree with all of that. I just want to bring up, like, we have been kind of tracking over the last, 3 to 6 months, a milestone where we've been collecting ideas for the v3 spec, which includes some of the type promotion things, but it also includes other things. And I think the question is just, for other ones that people have identified, do we want to try and get them in? Do we want to move these into a different, like, future spec kind of milestone, so we can at least have one curated area where we're kind of like, hey, this is the agreed upon things that we're going to be working toward. And Russell, I think you also started like a project for v3 tracking. I don't know if we want to kind of overlap that with this once we have these defined and like any tasks that are related to it. I'm open to that. I think it would be helpful to at least acknowledge the other ones that people have brought up and say, do we think that that's really relevant for this release, or is it something that we can push out? Like, a good example would be multi-column transforms. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of change, and I'm not sure that we've seen a lot of interest in it recently. So it's a question of like, do we push that to a future release, or does somebody want to pick it up and try and get in? Would we want to exclude it for some reason?
Yeah, I mean, I see the appeal of the thematic format version swap, but I also just kind of want to get in as many things as we can in each change. Just so you know, my project is mostly because I wanted to track all the logistics of all the other stuff we have to do that's like completely unrelated to new features, but just we have to get the upgrade path working, and we have way too many tests that are like v2 something something, and I'm like, oh, every single one of those needs to get parameterized now, so that we don't have them only running on v2. But yeah, I would like to get in as much as possible, although Ryan, I don't know, now that you've said it as like the type release, that kind of sounds appealing to me as a way of describing what's going on.
I mean, I think I do see like hey, if something's ready to go in, why not do it, right? And I have no problem with that. So, if multi-arg transforms, I think that the spec for that is actually, fairly straightforward. Like, the question is, do we want to, gate releasing proper support for v3 until we actually add the implementations of it? I don't know. I'm cool leaving that vaguely open. Like, we also would love to add like some compatibility things beyond like new types that might get in. But I would say like having an overall idea for a release and saying like, at least using that as a way to say, okay, if we're gonna add variant, we should probably also add null, right? Because we just don't want to string that out. So maybe as more of a like, let's prioritize certain things rather than pushing things out.
Okay, think that's fair. Sorry, JB. I know I keep jumping on top of you and you have your hand raised. I just had one more thing I wanted, because like one of the thing I kind of want to propose and see if we all have agreement on for the next spec version for 3 is the row lineage as a concept. I know Delta has a concept of this. I'm working up on the doc of formalizing how we would kind of do this. Me and Ryan have talked about this a little in private, but obviously I want everyone else to become involved and kind of talk about what this would look like. But I'm wondering, does that fit in the same concept, or because theoretically it shouldn't be that much actual work on our side, but it is something that all of the engines have to be compliant with, so it has to be in the spec.
I mean, I would support that. A lot of things. Sorry, JB. I think a lot of things come down to when people prioritize getting them done.
Yeah, that's fair.
Like, I think, Russell, you and I are both very interested in those things, and like that naturally means that someone is driving it forward, whereas like the application ownership stuff, like I'm interested in solving that problem, but I'm not interested in like spending it's just not the highest thing on my list. So like I think putting that out is reasonable. JB, sorry about that.
No worries. I have just 2 comments. I think that it's important to have at least an implementation of a spec at some point, because sometimes we may have to change the specification when we see the implementation and we're struggling with the implementation. That's the first comment. And second comment is I totally agree with Dan about what we include in a release. Maybe what we can define is a kind of deadline, like everything which is not finalized at that point is going to be pushed to the next release, something like that. Because, I mean, else we will never release. If we wait, everything is done. It's almost impossible. So if people are happy to implement and can move forward pretty fast on some spec changes, then they can do that. But if it's not really at that, I don't know, maybe a month before release or 2 weeks before the release, then we agree that it's going to be included in the next one, something like that, just to give a chance to anyone to push for changes.
Yeah, I think the only tricky thing is we do keep the spec as a part of the repo, so technically it does get released whenever we do the reference implementation release. Like it's right. In an Apache release at that moment.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's just a consequence of the site, because the site build, like every time spec changes, it should be reflected in the site build. And I think that I actually need to go through and clean up like we did for V2, and say like V3 is the following things, and have a notes about how to maintain V2 and V3 compatibility, because we need to think about how we add types and those things.
I was thinking more logistically, like technically the Apache release is a source bundle. Within that source bundle is spec.md.
It's not.
It's not? We don't include it?
It's not. We specifically call out source directories to include in that bundle.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, then that's all different then. Never mind.
Yeah, so that was the way we call Git archive. Maintains the Git lineage, and also like selects certain directories so that we don't end up. This was how we avoided having like the Python code included in every source bundle for the Java release.
Cool.
Okay, so I think it sounds like there's vague agreement. We do need to discuss all of this on the dev list, I would say. Saying like, hey, what do we actually want to get in? What are people going to drive to completion to get these things done? And I think that asking for commitments to like, hey, we're going to get these features done is probably a good way to filter out the things that aren't going to make it.
Just one more thing on this. I know we said we were going to talk timeline. I don't think we ever explicitly said this. I assume we're doing 3 months. We're going to target October then for the next 1 to 7 months.
So this is another good reason not to target. It's kind of up to you.
Okay.
I think there's a good reason not to necessarily tie format v3 to things.
Oh, not the format. I meant the 1.7 release.
Get format v3 things done in the next 3 months, because we may want to pull 1.7 forward. I've heard people mentioning that the pre-plan and plan APIs are pretty critical to their roadmaps, and so we may want a release with that. I think also having Kafka Connect released is a really good idea. So like we may want to just have some of this stuff early. Dan?
Sorry, you mentioned one of them. So Kafka Connect release is one that I think we would want to pull forward. We also have a couple others that are in the works. One is the repair table procedure, which I think is particularly important, as we've seen a lot of people that get themselves into bad situations one way or another. And I think UFA has some additions to that potentially to like repair stats, but that would be a really good one to get into an actual release for people. I think that there's one other that I just forgot. So.
Well, that's fine. Let's make a list up then, and we'll say potentially this is not going to be a 1 quarter release. It'll be a milestone release or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's good to discuss. Like we probably should not do an earlier release based on rumors that I hear. Like I always encourage people to come to the community list and say like, hey, I could use a release for this or that. And I would say like as release manager, like that's going to be your call.
Do we have any problem with releasing with the reference implementation of v3 spec features as long as they're v3 gated? It should be fine. We don't need to bundle them all into a single release, right?
Definitely not. I mean, that's something I feel strongly about. Is anything that's ready should be out. We just say we aren't saying to the community that v3 spec is closed, and if you're using v3 at this point, you're essentially in a preview version of v3.
Yeah, agreed. So is that how we want to handle is that how we want to handle preview features? Because I know variant, for example, and timestamp nanos as another example are types that people want to start using pretty quickly.
I think that gets to what JB mentioned earlier. It's kind of like, as you start with a reference implementation, you may want to change aspects of the spec because you realize you forgot or missed something in the definition. And like variant is a good example of one where we could have to go back to the spec and update it. So I think getting the reference implementation, having it v3 gated, and just saying that like v3 is not adopted yet, but you can use the features if you're exploring it. I think that that's fair. We don't get into a parquet situation where it becomes the standard despite not being actually formally adopted, though. So that we just need to be careful about that.
Yeah. We should be careful, but I think I like that. So Parquet does this where you can use the unreleased standard in order to get sort of preview access to new features. Then it also supports in backward compatibility, at least within the reference implementation or the Java implementation. It supports reads, it can always read the data that was written that way. So I think that that's a bit of a commitment. We don't have to make a decision now, but that's something that we should think about as we're releasing code, that if people do this, we need to know whether or not we're supporting things that they wrote while v3 was in preview.
Does Iceberg intend to be Java first, or does it intend to be like language agnostic eventually? I'm not saying one is better than the other, but if the reference implementation is Java, then it's easy to say, well, if it's in the spec, then it really ought to exist at least in the reference implementation. If that's Java, then good.
So I think we use the Java implementation as a reference implementation because it tends to be the thing that is most up to date. It's the oldest implementation and things like that. The spec should certainly not depend on any language. So we want to be language agnostic, but there are always things that, you know, so Micah from Google is great at finding these areas where the spec didn't really cover it. And, you know, you kind of go to the reference implementation and see like what was the intent and things like that. I think Java is probably going to still be that. And making sure that there's only one place to go, I think makes the most sense. Because I wouldn't want to say like, hey, for this feature, go check out how Rust works. And for this other feature, go check out the Go implementation. Like it makes sense to prove out and, you know, because when we make these spec changes, we want to have an implementation before we finalize them and sort of burn that in a bit. So I think it makes sense for that to continue to be Java.
I think this is also a good point that anything we put in the spec should be easily implementable. Like, we shouldn't be writing things where we're like, we're not really sure how you would implement this in Java or any other language. So if anyone does see things where they're like, there's no way to do this at all in Python or whatever, we should consider not having that be a part of the spec.
Yeah, agreed. And also fix areas where we have inadvertently added reliance on Java class names and things like that.
We also have the flip, which is occasionally the reference implementation will impose something that's not called out in the spec. And we've had a couple cases like that come up. And then it's just a question of like, do you update the spec to correspond to the reference implementation, or do we need to figure out some way to fix the reference implementation in a backward compatible way? It happens, and that's the value of having the reference implementation is like you have a spec and a reference to determine what the intent is and figure out how do you resolve those. I think Faco has found a lot of those in the Python implementation.
Chuanhua?
Hello. I recently found such case in our config names. For example, S3 access key ID is a constant defined in our Java implementation and borrowed by Python implementation and then come to our Rust. So I propose to put those constants into our spec instead. For example, config value like S3 endpoint, S3 access key ID, S3 access secret, or such things. I think we need to have a spec we can agree on to make those config value in spec. Yeah.
I think that's a good idea. Another area where I think we've added a lot of things that are not required, but definitely what we want are table properties as well. So things like Parquet right settings and that sort of thing. So I think formalizing a couple of those areas would be a really good addition to the spec. Yeah, please open PRs and highlight them on the dev list, and we can get through those. Thank you.
Hufei? Oh, we can't hear you.
Yeah, you're muted.
I think so we have a separate discussion with them. Last time we checked with catalog configurations. These are just conventional, not in the spec. But I think so Daniel and me also agree on that. Sometimes we not putting the spec because it's might subject to change, especially for some things involved quickly. It is subject to change. So if we write into spec, then it's of course very convenient for all these language or all these implementation to kind of finalize, use this fixed name to that. I would say at the same time we might make some mistakes sometimes, and then we have to fix that in the spec. Yeah, I think the point is we can over time we can try to bring more and more configuration to the spec, but it's always this great error that it's all just a convention. We use Java as the reference implementation for these configuration names, especially, and then the other implementation I just point to that one, so that we know where we look at and keep that consistent over multiple implementations.
Yeah, thanks. And in fact, many our config values can't be put into our spec because some of them are just Java class names. For example, file IO class, such things we can't put them in our spec. Maybe we can start with some our common consensus. For example, like our credentials, how we configure them, we can put those parts in our spec first.
Yeah, and I think we can also introduce, type enums or values for things like, where we previously used like a IO implementation property. We can just say, IO type or IO something to say like S3 and then map that in each language, right? If you want, S3, then each language can define its own way of identifying your particular S3 class, maybe through environment properties or, Spark properties or whatever.
Yeah.
That was definitely an oversight on our part in the early years.
I mean, some are actual implementation specific, and like I think it is a little complicated because, like as Ryan said, that there are like general table level properties that we kind of use to declare behavior that we expect that are agnostic to the language. There are other ones that currently are somewhat language specific but could be agnostic, and then there are ones like the metrics info for the reference implementation, like that's an actual class that only applies to the Java implementation. Maybe Python will have something different entirely. So there's different categories of these, and we kind of just need to figure out, well, which are the ones that we want to be consistent across languages, which ones are not, and where have we made assumptions about the underlying implementation that we really shouldn't be.
I also, for the table properties, I like the section of the spec that Micah just introduced, which is basically conventions used by certain engines, but that are not, strictly required by the spec. So like, currently time travel behavior is there, which is saying like when you time travel to timestamp as of, you want to use the table history in order to do that time travel, so that you get what a person would have seen running a query at that time, rather than trying to find a version in potentially rewritten history. I think that that's a healthy place to put some things like this, where the spec doesn't need to be opinionated. But we do have conventions that are encouraged across engines. So we could put a table properties section into implementation details that says this is how most implementations set the file type and the compression settings, etc. I think that would be useful. All right.
The table property already defined in the Iceberg doc. It's not tied to, it doesn't say which language or which engine.
Table properties are defined in them? I don't recall.
We have a tables properties section in the docs. So what was pointed out previously, particularly by the Trino team, was that like some of those are like Spark specific properties, some of them are generic Iceberg properties, and we don't really delineate between like, hey, where does it apply to an engine, like what is required versus just encouraged to respect that. So hey, if you set the Parquet, or if you set the file type to Parquet, like, do you have to produce Parquet, or is that just, you know, what the preferred format is? So I think that there is some amount of specificity that we could provide and just clarify any of those things, like, hey, it's required or it's optional.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We are out of time, and I see people dropping off left and right. So good to see everyone. Thanks for a great discussion this week. See you next time.
Bye-bye.